Welcome to Blue Collar Mystics, the under-the-hood approach to the depths of human consciousness. So many mysteries, so little time, so many big words. That's why we aim to take the mystical and make it practical, usable in your everyday life. And you know, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your story. What happened when you started asking yourself the real questions? Like, who am I? What is this? Is it a hologram? Is this some kind of weird cosmic joke? Hey, these are the questions that we are trying to get to the bottom of as we explore the final rabbit hole together here as Blue Collar Mystics. Spoiler alert, everybody. It is a cosmic joke. Very serious one. But a cosmic joke nonetheless. Yeah. We'll skip to the punch. No, I'm excited. We won't do any spoilers from the actual show. We're going to discuss a little bit tonight. But I also just want to really touch on the topic and the ideas and Todd's journey. I'm joined with Christian Pierce. We did a episode on this maybe a few weeks ago, several weeks ago, a couple months ago, something like that, with Mark Steves of My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And we were just talking about the show and the ideas. And I thought we'd make a show about it, and you guys saw it and commented, and here we are. We've done the whole dance. We've texted and messaged and put the calendar dates all together and everything. And I really appreciate you, Todd, for taking the time for being here, and Christian as well. We're able to talk about this incredible documentary that took you several years to make, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And I'm really excited about the principles that are presented in it. And I thought we would mostly touch on that, but also your story and your journey with making the production. So thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk a little bit about it. The Anarchists is on HBO. You guys can find it. It's HBO. You can stream it up there. It's really cool. One of the coolest things that actually Christian and I both now have in common is our mothers understood principles from the show that we had been talking to them about for, God, probably years, you know? Like, I just would tell my mom, like, you own yourself, right? Like, she's a Christian, right? And so I'd be like, do you own yourself? And she's like, well, I'm kind of God's property, right? Like, like the Kirk Cameron song. You know? But yeah, so thank you so much for being here. We're just going to kind of open this up very casual. I want to talk about the show and what you're doing musically and artistically, and just share about your experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's kind of interesting just watching your intro right now. It had me thinking again a little bit, or rethinking my own origin story as far as how I got into just this philosophy, as well as like the desire to interconnect it with art and filmmaking in some way, which I should say was not the primary like goal of making this show. I ultimately just wanted to tell a cool story. I met these people a while ago, back in 2016. One of them actually even earlier, in 2010 was when I met One Galt. But typically when I've said and I'm just launching into, you know, sorry if you had a structure.
No.
But watching your intro, though, it made me think again how I've, you know, been saying quite a bit that my first exposure to anarchism was through punk rock, which was my first ideology, my first love. I got addicted to it when I was 13 years old. But watching the intro made me think again about not my intro to anarchism, but my intro to philosophy, which actually went back to my interest in filmmaking. I remember I saw as a kid this documentary. I don't even remember what the deal was. I think it was linked to some kind of like strange cult or something, but it was called What the Bleep Do We Know? I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't. I don't want to disparage it. I don't know what I'm talking about. But it blew my mind as a kid, though. I was like, oh my God, like these are the things that I feel like I should have been talking about in church. I was raised Catholic, and like these are the ideas. Like, why are we not discussing existence and what it means to think and be? And that led me to look into philosophy. And then I watched another movie quickly that was much better, much more rooted in intellect, which was a Richard Linklater film, Waking Life.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, that completely blew my mind. And then I fell in love with all of Linklater's work. And that inspired me to become a serious filmmaker as a kid, because I, saw this format of, I was like, oh, you could tell stories in any way. And it doesn't have to be just a movie in the traditional sense. So that was the beginning of both my filmmaking journey and my philosophical journey, which then evolved into interest in some different ideologies. And I studied philosophy in college and while I was studying journalism, and eventually started this wild project.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that you did, because this was an idea that was really impactful to me. I had just come out of college maybe a few years earlier, and kind of had to come to grips with some realities in the real world that were not even close to what I was taught in school. And I had like this moment that was kind of like earth shattering for me. But I found these ideas in this philosophy, and it made a lot of sense to me. But one of the things that I think that I've noticed in myself, I won't project it to anybody else, is that I could get these values, but I was still kind of unhealed too. It's like I could understand this stuff, but there was a lot of work that I needed to do spiritually as well. So I think those two kind of worlds can collide. And I think what what your show kind of shows is human nature. And I'm curious, what got you into these ideas of this specific type of anarchy, or on this trail, chasing these folks into Anarchapulco? Were you already like thinking this way, and you were like, oh, because of punk rock, or was this kind of a new brand for you?
Yeah, I was, in the sense of my work in music. I was playing in punk bands when I was a teenager. I was playing a type of music that it was after all of the punk bands had sold out, and like no one was even interested in punk music or emo anymore. It had gone, to the mainstream and then back underground. And we were just doing it because we loved it, and we had no hopes of really getting signed to a big record deal or anything. So we had to learn how to make our own career and make our own way, and try to build our own systems that were outside of the mainstream corporate entities. So me and my friends, my bandmates, had these basic ethics that we just developed through that. And as I started to explore the music of that scene, I started to learn more about the culture and anarchism. And I had this, like I said before, this interest in philosophy and trying to understand the world and what are concepts and where do they come from. And a lot of bands, the ones I was into around that time, were bands like Against Me and Anti-Flag. Really, they alluded to anarchism, but they had signed to major labels and had gone corporate and had big careers. So it left me kind of suspended in this state of like, well, that's interesting, but also I've noticed this pattern of, young people, and this is me at age, 15, thinking like, well, they get into it and then they realize, well, the real world is maybe more complicated than that. It's kind of disappointing to realize that at such a young age, but I still was interested in it. And I became of voting age in 2008. I was 18, and that was when Ron Paul had his presidential campaign comeback. And I thought he was the most punk rock candidate that I could find. He wasn't perfect, but seeing him go on stage in front of all of the Republicans and, ask them, I think the moment that stuck with me the most was him questioning drug prohibition. And he asked the entire audience, well, if heroin was legalized, who in here would go out and, start shooting up heroin? And of course, nobody raised their hand. And to me, that was just kind of badass. And I was like, okay, I'll get behind this guy. We all know how that ended. And then that led me to the Libertarian Party very briefly. And that was even more, I don't know, disappointing.
Sure.
So I had this interest in anarchism from punk rock, and I started looking it up and realized, oh, there is this, crossover between libertarianism and anarchism, and they're not against business and commerce, which a lot of the left-leaning anarchists that I had met when I was younger seemed to be. And it just seemed kind of like a compromise between, the punk rock impulse, but, the need to create order. So I studied it. I went to college, started studying philosophy, and argued with my professors probably very terribly and thought I was very right because I had learned this new concept of anarchism and they didn't seem to know much about it. So I think then I had a period where I was listening to Molyneux, and which I'm sure you guys know a thing or two about him.
Sure.
And this was way back in like 2010 too. So this was before he had his big sort of, I don't know what you call it, change of heart.
Heel turn.
Yeah. But I met a lot of people in that community and went to a few meetups, went to a meetup at his house. And it was cool at the time. That was how I learned about cryptocurrency in 2010. Everyone was excited because Bitcoin had just hit $1. And, we thought we did it. We were there. It's dollar parity, problem solved. But yeah, I, met some people and then kind of just things got a little weird. I don't know if I could get into that, what happened at Molyneux's house. It was, kind of like a scene out of The Master. I don't know.
Oh, that's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah.
Do tell.
Well, if you, for those who don't know, this is the film that's I think it's Paul Thomas Anderson directed it, if I remember correctly, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman. He plays a character based off of L. Ron Hubbard. It's kind of like a loosely based off Scientology, but he does this thing where he psychoanalyzes people in front of his community in his house, in his living room, and it gets really intense and everyone's watching and the person is sort of broken down and exposed. That was kind of happening at Molyneux's house. I thought we were mostly going to be just talking about Bitcoin and peaceful parenting and just hanging out and philosophizing. It was a little more intense than that. I started to question, whether or not I wanted to get myself wrapped up in a community built around an ideology because of that. I started to, realize if I'm promoting someone else and attaching myself to them, whatever happens with them, I have to bear that. And I don't really know Stefan Molyneux that well. So, and then I just learned more about the world and realized, that's not really that helpful or beneficial to me to say I am an anarchist. Like, this is me and this is what I believe. It's kind of just a limiting way of approaching the world. So, I focused on my art and music, continued to, read some of the books and still listen to the podcast. And one of the people, though, that I met at Molyneux's house happened to be this young man who goes by the name Juan Galt. And he, over the years, we were connected on Facebook and started to go down to Mexico more often, and then going to Acapulco, and then talking about Anarchapulco, which is don't know how much of your audience has seen the show, but that's or knows about Anarchapulco, but that's the centerpiece or the main hub of the events that take place in the Anarchists. And I reached out to him and saw, oh, wow, there's this interesting community of people who are just going there and staying. And these ideas that I learned about a long time ago and people were just speaking about in the abstract, now there's this group of people who are trying to really live their lives by these principles in a very, very radical way. And knowing that it's in such an amazing, just a visually beautiful place like Acapulco, but also the controversy around that city and the perceived or real danger, depending on who you ask. So it seemed like the seeds of a, really interesting story. And it turned out to be just that.
It was. It was a really compelling story. One of the things I loved about it most is it had, so much philosophy, but then there was this narrative built into it. Without giving too much away, it got really juicy and really suspenseful at points. But it also it was set against this backdrop of philosophy, like you said. So I thought it was a really, really great piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I try to view documentary filmmaking because traditionally it's an educational medium, like in its origin. It's the earliest documentary films were just, created to give people information and to teach them something. And it's only quite recently where the format has kind of shifted and become closer to scripted narrative filmmaking. And a lot of it has to do with just the tools we have available now that weren't at the beginning of the format, where we can shoot cinema quality footage for 10 hours a day, which, you couldn't do that even 15 years ago. Everyone back then were shooting on handy cams, or if you wanted that quality, you had to be shooting on film, which costs you, tens of thousands of dollars just for a day of shooting. So, my philosophy toward it, my approach is to, treat it like picking out a good steak. You got to have a mixture of protein and fat, and I think the idea is to meld these two traditions. You can still use the format to talk about real issues and real ideas, and expose people and teach people about the world. But now we have the tools to create dramatic narratives that really compete with scripted television and scripted film. So we have the ability to do both, and I think it's a really just fantastic time to be making this type of art.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so how exactly did you get into documentary filmmaking? Like, was there a specific pivotal moment where you decided, like, this is what I want to do for my life?
Yeah, I was always split pretty 50-50 between music and filmmaking. And when I was young, it wasn't really a particular interest in documentary filmmaking. I just liked the idea of, moving pictures and sound and having all of the tools of every art form that you can put together and combine and have, a limitless palette of entertaining and educating and connecting with people. And I think my heart really actually is still with narrative filmmaking. I love that more than anything. And I think that's, kind of comes out in the series that, I love a good narrative and I love a good human interest story. And the documentary part really came just because of the accessibility of the format. I didn't have the privilege of going to one of the major film schools like USC or NYU, and didn't have, a rich uncle to give me 50 grand to, hire actors and hire a cinematographer. And documentary filmmaking is something that anyone can do. And you just have to know a little bit about shooting and sound and how to edit. And with the affordability of the equipment now, there's, nothing stopping anyone. So when I was in college, I started shooting documentary style commercials, and that's how I was making money on the side while I was studying. And yeah, I started up a couple documentary projects with some friends, and I was doing some like local access shows for a while. And yeah, I just kept doing that, and it became familiar because it's what I could afford to do, and did a couple small narrative shorts on the side. But it really is, for me, it's just about filmmaking in general. I think you kind of just do whatever you need to do for any given story to tell it. And in this case, a documentary opportunity opened up for me.
Very punk rock.
Yeah.
Very punk rock.
Thank you. That is the best compliment you can give me.
Like working with the invisible hand of creation, and just saying, did you just kind of see the opportunity in that way where you were like, I've got skills, whatever, Anarchapulco is happening, this is interesting. Were you already going down there? What made that the centerpiece?
Yeah, I had been following Juan on Facebook. Like I said, I knew this community was forming down there, and I had been working on a couple other projects at the time. People often will look at someone in my situation and be like, "Oh man, he's lucky. He just happened to be there at the right place, right time." But you don't see how many times I was starting a project and when I was in, wrong place, wrong time, or nowhere, doing nothing, and wasted days and weeks of my life. So there was plenty of projects that started and went nowhere, and this was just one that in that long list of projects that I started in my early 20s and going into my mid 20s, that I just kept grinding at it, and I thought, well, I'm looking out for my next opportunity and the next story to tell. And yeah, I went down to Acapulco with the camera, thinking, I don't know exactly what this will be. Maybe it'll be a short that I can submit to festivals, just an interesting, quirky sort of human interest short, or something that I could submit to an online magazine or something. And I got down there and I met these people, and they were far more interesting than I ever could have imagined. And also, I didn't have enough time. I was only there for a week, and I spent the first 4 days not even shooting, just getting to know everyone and figure out who would be comfortable being interviewed and being on camera. So I only shot my first round of, a handful of interviews with the Freemans and John and Lily, who I also met on that trip, and Juan, of course, who ended up, being an important voice, and Erica Harris as well. And yeah, I met them and found them all compelling in their own unique ways. And I also could see their differing and divergent views on anarchism and freedom and what that meant, which gave me reason to believe that I had the foundation for some sort of conflict that would emerge over time as this community tried to do their thing. And yeah, I watched from afar and left that first trip not knowing what I was going to do, just thinking, oh, I probably have to come back if I want to do something else. And next year came 2017, the big crypto boom, which brought a lot of change in the community, which, we dig into in the series. But that's when I really started to think, like, okay, well, seeing Anarchapulco explode in this way, and now that there's potentially thousands of people going to the conference, and John and Lily were forking the event and starting their own conference, it just seemed like maybe there was gonna, I could definitely have enough for a feature if I really wanted to dig into this. And yeah, I kept digging, and things just, got deeper and deeper. And I still don't feel like I've hit bedrock yet. I feel like this is a story that could keep going on for a while.
Well, I'm sure that's true. I mean, and I can't imagine how much like footage and just stuff wound up on the cutting floor, imagine God, like how much stuff you're having to film. Yeah. Like you were saying, we are privileged to have the technology these days that we do.
Yeah. It also means disappointing a lot of people, though. A lot of people don't realize, they'll sit down for a long interview with me, give half their day, and that it's like, you take it to the edit, and you have to overshoot doing a documentary. You're not working off of a script. So you need to know you have more than you need, and you just end up losing. There's a few entire interviews we had that were absolutely amazing, and just didn't have a place in the show because the story itself was so rich, and the characters we had who were directly attached to the story, were able to explain so much and give so much to the narrative that we were able to streamline it more. But also it's always a disappointment. You have these great conversations that are just sitting there locked away in the archives, and hoping maybe something will come up to put them to use.
Hopefully you have more footage of Jeff Berwick rapping. That was definitely the highlight. I was like, man, this is can't get better than this. It's great.
Canadian rap.
Yeah. I think he said he was Canada's number 2 or number 3 best rapper in 1986 or something, which I think there was probably only 2 or 3 Canadian rappers back then. So
yeah, Jeff Berwick was one that I was not necessarily as familiar with, but I definitely recognized a lot of people from the show, specifically Larkin Rose, who big shout out to him, man. Some of his work just hit me so hard. Like a couple of his books, even I think I read all 3 of them. They were all really good, and he's so very matter of fact about the philosophy that he talks about. I even just saw a video that he put out just a couple of days ago about how the Constitution is not itself like a document about freedom at all, and that's pretty consistent. Did your like views about anarchy change? Like, I know a lot of people, they don't even know what anarchy is, right? And so they see a show on HBO, like my mom or yours, Christian, right? And they're like, oh, the Anarchists, they're going to tear some shit up. What's this going to be? It's just like setting a bunch of stuff on fire or whatever. But how would you how would you describe the people's philosophy that you documented there at Anarchapulco? You could, like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what made the show so interesting, especially the first half of the show, was kind of the disagreement over what it meant to be free, and how there were some people who I think leaned or attached themselves more to the concept of anarcho-capitalism, which is friendlier to voluntary hierarchies and to having large organizations that use some sort of system of property rights. I don't think anyone's really figured out what that system is, and how they're enforced. But from a more spiritual sense, they're more okay with that idea of people giving orders and other people kind of not thinking as much and just listening. And in our show, the Freemans, Nathan Freeman and his wife Lisa, I think represented more toward that end. And on the other end, we had a group of people, or not really a distinct group, but people who more leaned toward the concept of agorism, which I find it interesting how it's like, even within something like voluntarism, people still sort of form a bimodal way of thinking. It's almost like they still get into the left-right paradigm, even within this subculture like voluntarism, where it's supposed to be to get away from that. It still kind of emerges, which that in itself started to make me question not necessarily anarchism, but ideological thinking, and approaching the world as if, like, there is this group of people who have attached this label to themselves and they're the good guys. They've figured it out. All I got to do if I'm, facing a problem, I got to go look up what Rothbard said or what Rand said, and they can give me the answer. I just say that, tell someone to go read it, and then conversation over. Not everyone in the movement is like that. I met lots of people who are very free thinking and love to have positive, healthy conversation. That was the impression I got from watching your show, is that you guys aren't really too, attached to like being a specific thing. You're more so just interested in ideas in general, and these are ideas that you were attracted to. That was my very brief impression. I could be
yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
Cool. Yeah, I'm not flying any flags, bro.
yeah
None whatsoever.
So that was an interesting part of the story, and it really, I had kind of already started to experience this perspective earlier on when I got into the Molyneux scene and saw how that went. So I had already been kind of hands off with ideologies and political movements in general. And part of it, I think, I'm not sure if maybe it was borderline conscious, unconscious, but I also wanted to see people who were going through that, people who were going through the same thing that I went through when I was a little bit younger. And, that experience of the euphoria when you find a new way of thinking and you start to realize. And this is something that I love about what Larkin Rose puts out there is, it's not so much about like just him saying this is how the world should be. I like how he just kind of shakes people a little bit and gets them to question the paradigms and the systems that they kind of just took for granted as inherent in reality. And Larkin has a good way of getting people to question those things. And that to me is kind of my favorite part about anarchism, is that it really is, it's not so much in its best form, in my opinion, about saying this is how the world should be. It's just saying, the world doesn't have to be anything specifically. The world is a blank slate, and we're the ones on a social level who create it. So a good analogy Jeffrey Tucker said to me, he was one of the interviews that we sadly had to drop, but he compared anarchism to music, whereas anarchism is kind of, it's not the music itself, it's not the song, it's not the melody, it's the notes on the page. And what you do with those notes and what you do with those rules of music is up to you. And you can create anything you want, and it can be beautiful. It could be, a Beethoven symphony, or it could be punk rock, or it could be some really, really chaotic, grinding new music that doesn't really appeal to anyone. But that is the conception of anarchy that I, through my whole journey, took, that I hold on to, and the drama and the politics and the identities and the belief that there is some category of thinkers who have figured everything out. I've tried to, as much as I can, leave that behind, and just promote the stuff that I like. And also not necessarily say it's anarchism, because they're also just ideas that I can talk about without putting a label.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've had to cope with is like I could come up with the perfect set of rules or ideology in my head that it would work out for me in my head, right? I'm never going to get to even test that, much less is it going to be adopted by the rest of the world. So, that's just one of the truths of the challenges that we face. But I think it's interesting because we're here as sort of armchair anarchists, and you've been, in the trenches, so to speak. That might be too accurate of a word. I apologize. But, but do you think that people, as far as an intentional community type of thing, do you think these types of things can happen? Can they happen in a healthy way, or is human nature always going to clown us when we try and do our own things? It's I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
I mean both. I think you can have both. I think any kind of community, whether it's a small one or big one, it's going to have its human challenges, and some communities will do better than others, and sometimes they'll step up and create systems to resolve conflicts, and sometimes they won't, and the community will fall apart. So I think some people will watch our show and be like, see, look, this, you can't do that because this is just how people are. But no, I think we need stories to, see failures in order to understand how we can do better ourselves. But yeah, I don't have, any kind of belief that you couldn't have some kind of intentional community like what the Anarchapulco folks dreamed of doing, and it could grow. But I would recommend anyone thinking about doing that, maybe try watching the series first and see what you can learn from these people's mistakes.
Yeah, I think that was what was so great about it, is it just showcased like the fallibility of human beings. And like you said, then we have a tendency to fall into like binary thinking, and in a way, maybe that's just kind of how we're structured. I had an idea for a book. Actually, we've already achieved the anarchist utopia, but then there's a war. So it's like it shows, it's kind of like a struggle, even with the so-called supposed like anarchist utopia, because there's still that element of human nature that exists.
Yeah, and I've wondered lately more and more just about that. Like, it kind of just became programmed in me to be like, no, we like no more binary thinking. Like maybe like this is the fundamental problem: is everyone is always us against them. And maybe it's kind of defeatist of me, but I sometimes wonder if that's just something that people need. They need, like, conflict propels society, and maybe the struggle is not so much to rid ourselves of that sort of us against them, but figure out how we can do it in a way that's peacefully and productive, and people are able to still change their minds. I have no idea what that looks like, but it's I tried more lately to think of issues like that when I see a problem with humans, not immediately think that it's bad because there are issues attached to it. And that, maybe there is some drive to that. Maybe competition is good. I think that it was in classical liberalism, the idea behind free markets and marketplaces, is to create a set of principles where people can use their natural competitive drive and channel it towards something productive. But yeah, it's hard. We haven't really figured out how to do that at the core level yet, when it comes to politics and governance. So yeah, or maybe we have, and I'm like just too caught up in my own structure of thinking to realize that we actually do live in anarchy, and we're just dealing with it in our
Yeah,
own.
maybe that's what it is. Maybe
Yeah.
this is just a way of dealing with it. No, yeah, I do. So I've done a lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy, and binary thinking is one of like the maladaptive thinking patterns that you're supposed to kind of just become more aware of. The idea is not to stamp it out completely, but just to become more aware of it and notice when you're doing it and it doesn't suit you. Because yeah, I think there's a tendency for us to like categorize things, and to a tendency for us to break off into opposing teams. And I think we just have to, I know I definitely have to get a little bit better at just noticing when I'm doing those things and it's not suiting my outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And a concept that I came across recently that's helped me deal with that and come to sort of negotiation with that is, rather than viewing it as binary when we notice these binary patterns in us, is embracing the concept of bimodality, which is a statistical idea that, rather than, on or off, true or false, you have, a two-part system. You have a distribution where things, on a curve kind of go like that and merge in the middle. But it's not just, A or B. There's, the pattern is real. Things do tend to split into two sides, but it's not just one or the other. There is a space in between and outliers on the far sides of it. And often that helps me come to terms with the, reality of the situation, and also, which is that there are often two sides of something, but then realize you can also have ambiguity and room for negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of parallels with like the spiritual concept of oneness, because it's all ultimately, at least in my belief, it's all ultimately different facets of the same one. So, or in the Kabbalion, it's opposames. So it's like, yeah, it's interesting how you find parallels and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really important to touch on too, is just a paradox, right? Like it's not all one thing or one all the other. It's like somehow we have to resolve that we are all part of the same thing, whatever existence is, the all or whatever that is. But we are also separate, right? And so you've got these folks who are like, they're finding out their individuality, their sovereignty, and they're stoked about it, right? But you've got all these people who are profound individualists trying to come together and create a group, right? So there's this dynamic at work that's really kind of contrary to the philosophy that they espouse, but we have to make room for both, right? Like that's that paradox, I think, is that we have to express our individuality, of course, right? I don't think people's rights should be taken for granted, right? As individuals, if you want to go be left alone or whatever, like go be left alone. But at the same time, if we're going to voluntarily work in a group, there's going to be a lot of circumstances and consequences that are going to arise from that, which is pretty crazy. And I think the show does a great job with that. Do you consider yourself an anarchist, Todd, still?
Depends how you define it. Yeah, I mean, if, defined in a way that someone like Larkin Rose, or, a lot of other philosophers who, not just the individualists, but the broad spectrum of historical anarchists who view it simply as the, intent of creating a society as much as possible that's based off of voluntary cooperative action and consent. I'm all about that. I don't know who wouldn't be. You know,
Right.
I think that's a very universal thing. But I mean, that's not what the word means to most people. To most
Right.
people, it means the Joker, you know, blowing up hospitals. So
Right. That's right.
I'm not that interested in being provocative. You know, at certain points in my life have been, and I think there's a place for that in our world, for provocateurs, and we had a couple of those in the series, but I don't, you know, see myself as one of those. I'm more of a journalist than anything.
Great. I'm definitely a provocateur. That's why I have this nobody for president hat.
I think that's kind of, you know, getting more and more universally agreeable.
Yeah.
Well, I love how you say that, because I could recognize it when I first started hearing people talk about these ideas. I was like, oh yeah, that innately feels true to me. And also this person is making logical sense, you know, in certain ways. Like, I mean, there, like you said, there's a lot there. Like you look at Proudhon, or, you know, who have, there's tons of different philosophers in anarchy, and they don't teach any of that shit in college. Like none of it. I was so stoked about philosophy too. And like all they did was tell me how wrong I was about everything. I was very disheartened, man. It fucked me up, dude. And English did too. But you know, you got to overcome, I guess. But I mean, like those, you don't get to hear that argument or that side. And so whenever, for some of us who don't ever get to hear that side, whenever you do, it clicks on, and it's like, what the hell? There's all this information, this whole entire other perspective, all these other ideas that I never knew existed. And they really do relate to how I feel, right? Like, I don't want to take your stuff, and I don't think you should take my stuff, right? Like, that's really, it's very basic, you know, like if we could start somewhere, simply with some of these ideas, I think it would make a lot more sense in society and to people, whether it's a small group and we are sort of us and them, or it's a larger group. I think the ideas themselves are relatively universal. Why do you think we can't do it?
Yeah. It's you know, I think I really hope, and I think, you know, in general, like the fact that we've built such a massive, complex civilization, and for the most part, people do act cooperatively, and that because that is the default. I think, you know, something I thought of. I thought of this recently. I watched Larkin Rose responding to the show. He was doing some updates on reacting to people's reactions to the shows, and he was talking about how he actually, you know, in his life preferred most of the people who would technically be defined as statist compared to a lot of the, you know, most of the people who identified as anarchists. And that's nothing to do with the philosophy. I think that's just kind of something that, you know, is more of a correlation to people who are drawn to radical ideologies, often have are experiencing something really challenging in their lives. So you get a lot of misfits and people who are dealing with mental health issues or financial issues. But yeah, you know, him saying that, you know, he was really, I think, saying, you know, most people, even though they on paper believe in the state, they believe in the government, in action, they are quite anarchistic in that they respect other people's property, they respect other people's sovereignty, they, you know, operate from the desire for love and compassion and wanting people to, you know, be well and, you know, not suffer. So I think we're probably doing better than a lot of anarchists like to think, or put out there. But often too, I think when people are linking themselves to ideologies, they're very often doing it because of something going on in their own lives, and their ideologies are often their discussions around them are expressions of their own personal challenges, which is something that is very true in our series. It's you know, our main characters, John and Lily, are themselves fugitives on the run, dealing with evading the law. And even before they were actually fugitives, they were trying to start lives that were sort of arbitrarily illegal, which was, you know, trying to grow cannabis and start a cannabis business and or in Lily's case, just treat her pain from a jaw injury. So yeah, I think we're doing all right. I think I think we always have room for improvement, and I think that is it. Though I think there will always be, lots of room for improvement, and even more room to make things worse, and that is just the human journey. That is.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And on that note, yeah, it's been a controversial series, so lots of haters and people screaming, "Oh, you're a shill," or FBI or CIA or like whatever. Do you have any thoughts on that? And as far as how, I don't know, like just anything regarding that?
Yeah, it's actually it has not been as bad as I thought it would be. For the most part, the people we were following in the series feel like we did a respectful job and we told the true story. I think what a lot of people don't know, and I get the outside perspective, it's like kind of wild that someone would like just happen to be there, like making an HBO docuseries as these murders were happening, and I can see where the conspiracy theory detectors would start to flash their lights. But like I said before, there are filmmakers and journalists out there all the time, like covering stories and looking for stories that go nowhere and nothing happens. And from the beginning, I wasn't like trying to pick the like craziest, most dramatic stuff. Like these were the people that I started to follow back in 2016 when they were in their honeymoon phase and excited about the future and dreaming big about this community. And I just continued to follow them and tell their story. And I think also for people who, I know you guys aren't as like invested in the conference and Anarchapulco. Have either of you been there? Or
I've never been. No.
yeah.
I'd love to go.
Yeah, and there is a divide between people who are just into the ideology and people. A lot of people feel protective of the movement down there and feel like we were trying to trash the conference or whatever. But these were the key players too. It's not like we just picked the worst people. It's like we picked the people who were running the events and were leading the change that was happening down there. So. Yeah, it's also interesting being on this side of it too. It's like how I've always sought out conspiracy theorists. I love hearing a good conspiracy theory because conspiracies do happen. So someone's got to theorize about them if we're ever going to reveal them. But to be on this side of it is kind of funny and interesting.
I'm sure it must be kind of surreal for sure to be there. Because I mean, you documented something, a group coming together, establishing something, and then somebody gets shot. I mean, that could be the story of the American education system, right? Like that's basically everything you're documenting is, within a certain it could happen anywhere, right? It doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong, it's just showing one attempt at putting, like I think you said it really well, like an ideological group together, which is going to have that's limited to just values. Maybe we need to widen our scope and start to add some other variables and metrics into our groups as we continue to learn from our own mistakes, but I mean, as far as like the danger and in that, I think what's the most important and what's so cool about what you guys have done is that you've put these ideas out there for people to actually consider. And that is, to me, really, really cool. Because like we talked about it the first time, and Christian was talking about how his mom, he was like, he had told her to watch the show to figure out some of these ideas. My mom, I swear to God, it was 2 days later. She was up here and she was like, I watched the show, The Anarchists on HBO. It was so good. It totally made sense. Like everything, a lot of the things that you've said before. And so if that's the case, then you've got a bunch of people talking about philosophy and exploring an entire world of ideas that previously were basically unknown. It's like unlocking a treasure chest if people will actually start to look into this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope I will say too, I've heard a lot of people come back. I know a lot of people that are like very, very deep in the movement and emotionally attached to it feel afraid because we've shown I think we showed a pretty broad view of the events that happened. It wasn't, the story was in the end very tragic, but we showed a lot of the highs and positivity that was going on. And I think, talked about the ideas in a, fair way that was true to what the people in the story believed. But yeah, and I've had plenty of people who don't even know me or like my background, that I had, my involvement. They just know me as a filmmaker and journalist who, came to me and they're like, wow, I was like, it's an amazing story, but also like, I had no idea that these were concepts that were out there. And I immediately went and, bought a couple books. And I hope too, in making the show, I saved them some time from like the movement aspect of philosophy and anarchism. And they can see, the distinction between that. I think audiences, even of mainstream media, are generally more intelligent than people give them credit for, and they can, parse things in that way. And I hope I just save some people the time of getting wrapped up in that, and instead
joining a cult. You're trying to help people.
That's one way. It's one way to put it. Yeah, joining a cult or a cult-like thing.
No, totally. Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners are going to be familiar with the concept of energetic pendulums, and that our identity is often wrapped up in things that are completely arbitrary to who we actually are in a real way. So fortunately, maybe unfortunately, I could probably make a lot more money if we didn't talk about concepts like that. But that whole idea of like cult and cult of personality, it starts to become, a thing that we see a pattern over and over and over and over again. And I just think it's really, really cool that you have been able to put these ideas out there and give them more of a platform. We still have to heal. We have to do the work. We have to understand what happens and what the consequences are when we identify with an ideology or a group of people or what have you, as well, and really grow and learn from our mistakes, other people's mistakes as well. So yeah, no, I love what you guys have done. And I'd love to know, what is next? What's the next thing for you to do?
Yeah, immediately in the short term, like I said, throughout my life, I've been divided between music and filmmaking. So it has been a true joy of having a little bit less of a hectic schedule, and getting to build out my home studio a bit, and also getting to collaborate with my wife, who's always right here next to me, Kim, who's an incredible songwriter and singer and musician. We produced and recorded 2 songs that were in the shows. They were the credit tracks for episodes 4 and 6. We're releasing those as singles on September 23rd. And that will eventually lead up to a full-length album that should be coming out sometime next year. And also, we're in the early stages of just enjoying the freedom of being able to work on anything we want now. So we've got a couple different documentary projects in the work. I'm getting back in touch with a couple of my earlier passions, like punk rock, and baseball is another one that for some reason I left for years, and now I'm getting back into. So a couple documentary ideas linked to those things that are in development, and maybe a couple scripted things that not making any announcements yet, but I'm also working on. So
that's awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I think scripted stuff would be really fun. And I've heard one of your tracks for sure, and it was awesome. Kim has a great voice, beautiful. And I'll put links to that stuff in the show notes. Cool to know that you're working on a full-length album. And that's exciting. The production, I wanted to say too, was excellent. Like the audio,
it was top notch.
Excellent. Great job with all of that. It was
thank you. I mean, we had an amazing team. That's the great thing about working with these bigger entities is you get to hire fantastic people. So we had some just really brilliant editors. We had lots of original music in the show by a composer named Antonio Sanchez. He's mostly known as a jazz drummer who composed the score for Birdman a few years back, which is absolutely stellar. But yeah, he went way beyond his jazz drumming in the show, and still had his jazz roots, which is kind of like a fun way to score a story about anarchism. I feel like jazz and anarchy go kind of hand in hand in some ways, in a very beautiful way. So yeah, he was fantastic to work with too. Just an amazing team of, co-producers and editors and graphics artists, illustrators. It was just such a thrill. So I don't want to take too much credit. I mean, I tried to, I felt like more than anything the keeper of the story, the person who's directing. But yeah, it takes a team to make a project like that. So it's always good to remember that when you're watching these shows. It's not just the one guy doing the interviews. It's a lot of really, really talented crew people as well.
That's awesome. Well, it turned out great. Yeah. And I do also say, I recommend to people, watch the credits at the end of one of these shows and see how many hundreds of names that it takes to be able to pull something like this off. It's not an easy thing to coordinate at all. The film stuff, I think a lot of people who probably hate and have these ideas, they just very often don't understand the process and the complications of all of these things, right? Like I've had the good fortune to work on a couple of things. And there's so many different variables and you got to please and producers and
especially hiring creatives. It's like just because you're the director, you can't force people to do creative things. You can't, creativity is something that has to be cultivated and nurtured, and that more than anything was, and maybe not more than anything, but that was a major part of the process as well, is just trying to create a positive community around a story that we're trying to tell. So yeah, it's a struggle making movies, but it's I think worthwhile one.
Definitely worthwhile.
Yeah. Great job. Yeah. And I appreciate and admire all the times you made projects that didn't make it this far, so I know it's a grind. I got the Bird Murmur website pulled up. Where should people come and find you? Bird Murmur is your production company.
Bird Murmur. We're on Instagram. You can follow me personally. My Instagram is kind of the only social media I have right now. It's just at Todd Schramke. And you can check out our music is under my wife's last name, which is just Kylland. Follow that to hear what we have coming out in that department.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put those links in the show notes. Christian, where can people connect with you?
Oh man, I am I'm gone from the internet. I've gone incognito for a little bit. But yeah, I'll be back. I got some big things in the works. I'm working on some content, just taking a little mental health break from social media. But Earth Magic Rising on the website will actually be up soon. So
cool. Awesome, man. Well, let me know what it is. I'll share it out. And yeah, follow Christian at Earth Magic Rising on Instagram. He'll be back there maybe at some point.
Very soon.
And yeah, dude, good for you. Leading the charge, doing a mental health thing. That's good.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the algorithm to forget all my buying trends. Then I'll hop back on.
Fair enough. That's a good strategy. Well, thanks a lot again, Todd. Thank you, Christian. Thanks everybody for listening to the show. Thanks, Kim. Y'all keep pumping it out. Can't wait to hear your full album. And we'll see you all on the next one. Peace out, everybody.